Somewhere in Siberia, 50,000 years ago, someone sat in the dark and threaded a needle made of bone. Their fingers were freezing, their hands were shaking, and their life depended on getting the stitch right. That needle still exists today. Archaeologists found it inside Denisova Cave, carved so precisely it could pass a thread thinner than a human hair. Think about what that actually means. Before writing, before farming, before almost anything we call civilization, humans had already solved one of the hardest engineering problems on Earth: how to keep a body alive in a world trying to kill it every single night. Here's the uncomfortable part. This wasn't a one-time crisis. It was every winter, for tens of thousands of years, without exception. So how do you survive a world with no walls, no fire that stays lit for long, and no way to call for help? You start with the shelter, and in the coldest parts of Ice Age Europe, that shelter often wasn't wood. At a site called Mezhirich, in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered something almost unbelievable. Circular huts built entirely from mammoth bones, skulls stacked as a foundation, tusks curved into door frames, ribs layered like beams. Each structure used the remains of dozens of animals. Each one required coordinated hunting, or scavenging, across an open, freezing landscape, with almost no cover. Why build with bone instead of wood? Because in that environment, there often wasn't a choice. Trees were scarce, bone was everywhere, and the dead became the only material dense enough to block a wind that could kill a person in under an hour. Now picture actually living inside one. No glass, no modern insulation. Just packed earth, layered hide, and a skeleton wrapped around your body while a blizzard screamed outside. For an Ice Age family, that wasn't a horror story. That was Tuesday. But shelter alone didn't solve the deadliest problem: the human body. We evolved in Africa, built for heat, not for ice. No thick fur, no blubber layer, nothing built in. So everything had to be added. Clothing wasn't fashion. It was the only thing standing between skin and frostbite. That's where the needle comes back in. Before it existed, clothing was just draped hide, loose and leaking heat at every seam. After it existed, humans could layer fitted skins, tied at the wrists, sealed at the neck, trapping body heat instead of losing it. One tool, millimeters long. And it may have decided which populations survived the next 1,000 years and which didn't. Here's a question worth sitting with. If your survival depended on a single tool this small, would you have figured it out in time? Because some groups didn't. At Sunghir in modern Russia, archaeologists found something that complicates the picture even further. A burial, roughly 34,000 years old, containing 2 children laid head to head, covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads. Each bead alone took hours to make. Multiply that by thousands in the middle of a brutal ice age, when every hour spent not hunting or building shelter was an hour closer to starvation. Why would a starving, freezing community spend that much time and effort on the dead? Because survival wasn't only physical. Belief, ritual, and social bonds may have mattered, just as much as fire and hide. A community that grieved together, that invested in each other even in death, may have been a community more likely to cooperate when it mattered most. And cooperation, more than any single invention, appears to be the real reason our species made it through. Archaeologists have traced shell ornaments and raw materials moving hundreds of miles from their original source. That means groups who never even met each other were still connected, trading, sharing knowledge, quietly keeping one another alive. Compare that to the Neanderthals, physically built for cold, stronger, more cold-adapted than we were in almost every measurable way. And yet they vanished. Some researchers point to smaller, more isolated social networks, fewer long-distance connections, less redundancy when a single bad season hit. If that theory holds, an entire branch of humanity may have disappeared, not because they were weaker, but because they were more alone. So here's the reframe. You probably think of survival as a solo skill: strength, instinct, sharp reflexes. But the deepest Ice Age evidence tells a different story. The bone needle survived because someone taught someone else how to use it. The mammoth-bone hut survived because group hunted together, not alone. The beads at Sunghir survived because a whole community stopped everything to grieve as one. Every single one of your ancestors made it through nights that should have killed them, not because they were unbreakable, but because someone else refused to let them freeze alone. You are here, warm, reading this because thousands of generations in a row chose each other over the cold. That's not a small inheritance. That's the whole reason you exist.